Well, welcome. It is good to see you all here, and I'm especially glad to welcome our speaker, Dr. Colin Kahl, who is, I want to assure you, the absolute best speaker we've had all academic year. This is really the highlight of the academic year thus far. But Colin also is a distinguished academic and practitioner who has served in a number of departments. He's now a professor at Stanford University. Just a friendly advice, get your Pac-10 football games in this season, I think. But he also most recently was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. But before that, served in the Obama administration, and before that served in the Bush administration. So he's had extensive public service and also extensive academic service. He captures exactly what is the best of AGS. And so before I grill him, I wanted to praise him. And I wanted to take a moment to tell you all about all the other stuff that's coming up. So bear with me, Colin, for a second. Next week, there's two events. One, on the same day, sadly. So you have to pick. You either come here, Mitch Landrieu here, the mayor, America's mayor here, or Giselle Donnelly speaking at UNC. And both will be interesting, but wildly different talks. So look closely and pick the one that is best for you. The week after that is a low point. We'll be talking about my book. But I will sign copies if anyone is foolish enough to buy it. The week after that, Corey Shockey is coming, and Colin knows her well. And then the week after that, on September 28th, we have an exciting event on the brand, America's Role in Global Sports, with Adam Silver, who's the president of the NBA, Sarah Hirschland, who's the CEO of US Olympics and Paralympic Committee, General Martin Dempsey, the retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Coach K, talking about that. So that should be a lot of fun. If you have, is this the first time you've heard about it? That means you're not getting our AGS email. Please sign up for that. But you did get enough information to come to hear Colin, and you're wise to do so. Welcome, Colin. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. How do we do this?
I think it's on, and just talk.
Hello. All right. Thanks, Peter. I've also heard you are the best moderator so far this year. There's actually, this reminded me of one thing. So the post I just left about 6 weeks ago is the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And when I came in April of 2021, I inherited the special assistant. So one of the younger civilians who worked in my office, and he had been there for 2 years, and I was the sixth person to occupy my office in 2 years, which is a indication of how much kind of instability and turbulence that was. And we were once talking about that. I said, "That's 6 people. That's a lot." And he's like, "Yeah, you're so much better." And I said, "Really?" And he's like, "Yeah, you're like my third favorite," which is good.
Good enough. So what does the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy do? I like to tell people it's the most important job in government that people outside of government don't understand.
Well, I mean, I think for those of you who know anything about foreign policy or national security, the easiest way to conceptualize the role of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is you serve as the National Security Advisor to the Secretary of Defense. So you are essentially the senior civilian advisor on all matters related to foreign and defense policy for the Secretary of Defense. So any equity the Pentagon has that touches on global affairs, global diplomacy, or national security policy, you're responsible for that. So I had a counterpart as an undersecretary who did intelligence and security. I didn't do intelligence. I had a counterpart that did acquisitions and sustainment. I didn't do that. A counterpart that did research and engineering. I didn't do that. Personnel and readiness. I didn't do that. Comptroller did the budget. The OGC did the lawyering, but I did the policy stuff. I sat over a core staff of about 800. And when you add up the agencies that reported to me, about 3,000 people. And divided into every country and region in the world, but also every functional domain. So think cyber, space, emerging technologies, war plans, strategy, information operations, nuclear policy, WMD, you name it, counterterrorism. So the combination of regional and functional expertise all came up through me. So a big part of my job was simply staffing through me and all the hundreds of people who work for me, staffing up to the secretary, our views on the position the department should have on various policy positions. But that meant we also provided all the background and talking points when the secretary traveled the world, or when he welcomed a minister of defense from some country to the Pentagon, or when he went over to the White House for meetings or anything like that. I also represented the department in the interagency, so in the at what's known as the Deputies Committee, which, if you think of the cabinet as the cabinet secretaries, the deputies are one layer below that. And the National Security Council, of which Peter served in the George W. Bush administration, runs a process that operates at all levels. And I was the senior representative for the Defense Department at the deputy level, so one level below the secretary level. And probably 80 or 90% of the national security issues culminate at that level. That is, they don't actually go to the principals or the president. So I sat in a lot of meetings in the Situation Room or remotely on every national security issue that we dealt with in the first 2.5 years of the Biden administration. And then lastly, there's a big role that I played in defense diplomacy myself. So traveling to foreign countries, welcoming foreign counterparts, my counterparts to the White House, to the Pentagon, to have conversations, dialogue. So spent a lot of time, especially with our closest allies and partners, in whether that be our NATO allies dealing with the crisis in Ukraine, or our Indo-Pacific allies and partners contending with China, or our partners in the Middle East contending with challenges like Iran. Spent a lot of time on defense diplomacy. So that's what the job is.
And you had served in the Obama administration as the national security advisor to the vice president. And you were there up really to the last day, weren't you?
Yeah, so I was then Vice President Joe Biden's National Security Advisor from October of 2014 through midnight on January 19th of 2021.
And you were packing up
20 whenever it was.
You were packing up his bags and his boxes and whatever got in.
No, I was not.
Okay, but I thought I could trap you with that one. No, the question I had was: had the world changed much from sort of 2017 when you left to 2021 when you came back in? What had changed and what had not changed?
Yeah, it's interesting. So so my last day on the job was January 19th of 2017. And then obviously I didn't serve in the Trump administration. I went back to my then professorship at Georgetown, and then shortly thereafter took a job at Stanford. And then I was back, not at the very beginning of the Biden administration, but just a few months in. I think one thing that really struck me was how much harder the world was. And I think it was harder in a number of ways. One, the issues we were contending with, the stakes of them just seemed bigger. We spent, at the end of the Obama administration, there was a desire, I think, to spend more time on great power rivalry or great power competition, but a lot of the lingering hangover of the post-Cold War and post-9/11 eras, the contending with rogue states, contending with terrorist organizations, still consume the vast majority of our time. So, I spent a lot of my time at the White House dealing with the counter-ISIS campaign in Iraq and Syria, or the negotiations over the Iranian nuclear program, or issues like that. We had far fewer meetings on China's building of islands in the South China Sea. We spent a lot of time on Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, but probably not on the broader Russia problem set. And so the issues just seemed bigger. The stakes seemed bigger. It would have been terrible for ISIS to have occupied on an enduring basis a big chunk of Iraq and Syria. But at the end of the day, the risk that posed to the United States pales in comparison to what a major power war with a nuclear peer would do for the existential, survival of our country. So the stakes seemed larger. The other thing is just seemed harder. The global balance of power was shifting. Now, it had probably been shifting under our feet in the last half of the Obama administration, and I think people can have an open and candid debate about whether we took those shifts in power seriously enough and invested enough in addressing them. But the distribution of power from an international relations perspective was different. The United States, still the most consequential actor in the international system, but the gap between us and others was less. And then third was just the effect of the Trump years. And I don't mean this in a partisan way. I just mean that the Trump years were a very traumatic period for our allies and partners around the world, because they saw a very different U.S. foreign policy, and one that was very much at odds, intentionally so, with the Cold War bipartisan consensus and the post-Cold War bipartisan consensus about the role that America played, and that had kind of unnerved our allies and partners. So the stakes were higher, right? The balance of power was different, and our closest friends and allies were less sure of us. And then the last thing that was different was just our country was different. I mean, I think our country, coming out of January 6th and the turbulence of the Trump years, there were real questions about whether America could hang together as a democracy, as a people. Could we govern? And it's hard to accomplish anything in the world if we can't govern. So it just seemed really, really hard. And nothing about the 2.5 years I served in government disabused me of that initial impression.
So let me take it down one level of analysis. Had the building changed? Had DOD changed? And in particular, the policy shop. You said you were the sixth in this four guys tenure. That must have created churn within the personnel, just the morale, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I was only the second confirmed person in those 2 years, but they were sixth because actually people forget, but in the last couple of years of the Trump administration, they really didn't confirm very many people, and they didn't actually even nominate all that many people. So you had a lot of kind of interim. So that's just, it's neither here nor there. It just is a lot of change and instability, and organizations, it takes a while to get used to the job, and then to get good at the job, and then execute the job. And if you're changing folks in those offices every few months, it's quite destabilizing. I would say because of how hard the world was, and I already described that. I think because of the domestic turmoil, and I already described that. And then of course, COVID. The workforce was pretty worn down, pretty burned out, pretty demoralized. And I would say this started actually at the end of the Obama administration. Most of you are too young to remember, but there was a big budget controversy over what was called sequestration, and essentially a kind of haircut across the board in the federal budget that really cut into our ability to hire and retain civilian talent. So we had fewer people. They were all burned out. They were all stuck at home because of COVID. They were all demoralized. And they were kind of felt rudderless because of the changes in so many changes in leadership. So it was a challenging environment to walk into.
Now, this is a question I didn't intend to ask, but how do you work from home doing national security classified stuff? Did everyone build a skiff at their house?
Yeah, not well. So we did, a lot of work gets done. For those of you who are familiar with the national security enterprise, there are different levels of classification. There are mobile kits to be able to do secret level work or SIPR level work at home. Not enough of them, but the organization generated enough mobile laptops essentially for people to do some work at home. They're not great, they're not super reliable, but you could do a little bit. And then the other things too, like if you had an office of 20 people, you did 3 shifts. Right. So people would come in, they'd distance, they'd send, you'd have 6 or 8 people in an office that's for 20, and you do kind of that, you do 2 or 3 shifts a day. And then just some work didn't get done, and some work that should have been classified probably got pushed down into unclassified. COVID was not the peak level of productivity for our government. It did also change the way that the interagency worked though, because you weren't convening in the Situation Room, which is this claustrophobic, it's just a conference room, right? It sounds fancy. You see it in the movies. It's not fancy. It's not sexy. It's not all that. It's just a little conference room. And so it's like a pretty good super spreader place for senior officials. So it also, interagency meetings migrated all to be secure video teleconference. So that was another big shift coming back, which was how much, COVID was still raging when I came back to the Pentagon at the beginning of 2021. So the Pentagon itself felt empty, and a lot of our interagency meetings were via secret Zoom, essentially, and that's a very different dynamic.
And you talked about all the ones who are acting rather than confirmed. Does that really matter? Talk about what you could do as a confirmed undersecretary that the person who's now doing your duties right now, she's not confirmed yet, what she can and cannot do. So talk about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the fortunate circumstance, I left, but my deputy, Sasha Baker, who's brilliant, fleeted up to be the acting undersecretary, but she's confirmed. So that's good.
Okay.
The building does not react well to non-confirmed people because you don't have the kind of reflective authority that a confirmed position has. And also they can wait you out. They just presume that like you're, and so I think in general, you tend not to get as much respect inside the building if you're not confirmed. And so that just makes it harder to do the work.
And just to be clear, Sasha is confirmed at the deputy level,
Correct.
not at the under.
Correct.
So
Correct.
is there, I guess, since you're not doing operational stuff, there's not legal stuff that your office is precluded from doing, but some on the operational side, there are some legal stuff you can't do if you're not the confirmed person, right?
I think that is right. I don't know that it had, I think basically a non-confirmed person could do the job that I did in terms of like what you have to do on a day-to-day basis, but whether you would have the level of, you would be given the level of respect or be seen to have the degree of authority, I'm convinced you would not.
And speaking of confirmation, you had a sporty confirmation hearing, a process. Talk a little bit about that and what your thoughts are on the confirmation process.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that just in general, our confirmation process has turned kind of into a blood sport. And it's not enjoyable for anybody who goes through it. In my case, it was particularly unenjoyable. I would say certainly the worst experience I've ever gone through in my life, and I've been treated for cancer twice. I think that the challenge that I had and that for my family was how deeply personal it was, which was just that, I have pretty thick skin and I'm happy to joust with people over ideas. And I've made a lot of arguments in my day. I've made a lot of predictions. I've made a lot of assessments. Some of them have been right. Some of them have been wrong. Some of them have been based on well-reasoned arguments, maybe some less so. I'm happy to have an intellectual or substantive conversation. It was the kind of the personalization of the attack and dehumanization that I found hard to just deal with. Part of it too was, the Trump era was an extraordinarily polarizing period. You all lived through it. It's not a partisan statement to say to make the descriptive point that the Trump era was a polarizing time. I've had very strong feelings about the policies of the Trump administration. I had worked up in the Obama administration up until the end, and then saw the administration come in and rip up everything we had spent the last 2 years working on. I didn't see my son for the first 2 years of his life, and then spent the first 2 months of the Trump administration saying, why did I even bother, since everything we worked on got ripped up? It could have been the TPP, once in a generation trade agreement, or the Paris Climate Accord, or the Iran nuclear deal, or the steps taken on Cuba, or you name it. And by the way, one can agree or disagree with any of those things, but just hard to deal with. So I had a lot of strong feelings about the Trump administration, and I exercised my rights of free speech and made those feelings well known in things that I wrote or things that I posted on social media or whatever. I was not unique in that. But somehow during confirmation, the fact that I had those views and that I voiced them as stridently as I did was seen as disqualifying. And the part of that bugged me the most, I think, was, so the committee I had to interact with the most as undersecretary, and the committee that oversaw my confirmation process is the SAS, the Senate Armed Services Committee. And the SASC has a collective...
And the ASC.
Well, right, but the
SASC
actually, confirms me that ASC is the other oversight committee, as well as the two defense appropriations committees. But the SASC is the committee that actually had to vote me out of committee and then recommend whether I get confirmed or not. The SASC has a collective identity, which is that they are, they work very closely together. They are defense professionals. They are nonpartisan or bipartisan in how they do their jobs. And I have a lot of respect for that. To a person, the men and women on the SASC, when they campaign for office, are hyper-partisan, right? When we run for election, you run for as a political party, you take on the other side, you run negative ads. Some of it's pretty nasty, it's dirty. Politics are messy, partisan stuff. And so what I think bugged me the most was what I saw as kind of a performative contradiction, which was here was essentially a committee full of people who, when they were campaigning for office, were bitter partisans. But then when they were in office, could govern in a nonpartisan, bipartisan way. And yet when I made the argument that I said partisan things, and I was pretty tough on the Trump administration and some Republicans in Congress, but that when I was actually serving in the Pentagon, I did so in a nonpartisan or bipartisan way, which was true, and that I would do so again, and that I had actually worked for 3 secretaries of defense at that point, and 2 of them had been Republicans, and one of them had given me the second highest award that the Pentagon gives out to civilians. That was dismissed as laughable, that it was impossible for me to be partisan on the outside and then nonpartisan on the inside, even though the people who were voting on me claimed to do precisely that themselves. So the whole process was terrible and highly personal. It took a terrible toll on my family. And the only upside is that I got the vice president to vote for me because she had to break the tie. And I believe I'm still the only person that the vice president has had to vote for to get into the national security space, which is great because when all my assistant secretaries would get confirmed, I'd ask, but did the vice president vote for you? And they'd be like, no, they did not. And I was like, you're not as cool.
So are you back on Twitter or X?
No. Yes, but no.
So I do, you are a teaching point for students. One way to describe, I won't say it's a mistake, but one way to describe you was you used to be very interesting on Twitter. And that was part of the issue, right? You said interesting, clever, sharp-edged things, and that's the stuff they threw back at you. So I tell my students, you know, if you're going to be interesting, be prepared for that to come back at you.
Look, I think that we all live very complicated digital lives. And I think that one of the things that is clear is that when you combine polarization, hyperpartisanship, the inherent theatrics of politics, the specific perversions of wanting to go viral on everything, with the fact that we all leave digital fingerprints from the time that we have a smartphone in our pocket, which, you know, for a lot of people is when they're 12, 13 onward now, you will leave breadcrumbs on, you know, what you searched on the internet, what you bought on the internet, what you said on social media, what you posted, what your, you know, what your email, something you thought was a clever, funny entendre as a 14-year-old as an email seems less appropriate when you're going up for conversation as a confirmation as a 30-year-old. So it's just to say that I think that our politics has not only not caught up to the realities of the digital age, but it combines all the vulnerabilities of the digital age with all the negative incentives to dehumanize for the purposes of getting that 15 seconds of fame on TikTok or X or whatever. So be careful out there. But the thing I worry about is none of us are perfect. None of us. And so I feel like if we set the standard as you can never have said anything controversial in your life ever in a way that somebody can track down digitally, or you can't be confirmed, we are going to very quickly get to a very small population of people who can take political jobs, and it might not be the best people.
Okay, so let's dig into policy now. Shortly after you arrived, the president had to make some consequential decisions regarding Afghanistan. Had he already made the decision by the time you were confirmed, or I forget exactly the date of your confirmation?
Yeah. So yeah, my hearing was in March, but I wasn't actually confirmed until the very end of April. So the president actually makes the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan about 2 weeks before I came into the building.
Okay, so we've just had the anniversary of that and a lot of second guessing, and now with the benefit of hindsight, critique. I'm curious what your view is with the 2 years of hindsight. How do you score how the administration did, not the outcome in Afghanistan, but how the Defense Department handled their responsibilities?
Yeah, it's interesting. I first of all, I think it's important not as an effort to actually absolve this administration of anything, because every decision this administration has made, it needs to own and be held responsible for. But to say that the withdrawal of Afghanistan began in April of 2021 is to ignore the fact that the withdrawal from Afghanistan began in February of 2020, when the Trump administration negotiated the peace agreement behind the back of the Afghan government directly with the Taliban in Doha that set the conditions for the US withdrawal. And that withdrew the majority of our forces. So at the time of that agreement, I think we had around 10,000 US forces. By the time we took office, we had about 2,500 US forces in Afghanistan. So Biden's decision was really to remove the final 2,500 and also the thousands of additional NATO troops that were there. Look, I'll say it this way. In my confirmation hearing, I said what I believed, which is that my advice would have been to essentially do a conditions-based withdrawal that tried to renegotiate the Doha agreement and interweave our withdrawal into that renegotiation. That would have been my going in position. But I also understand why that position ultimately wasn't taken by the president. I think at the end of the day, he believed that any effort to reopen the Doha agreement would be seen as reneging on the Doha agreement, and that American forces were not being attacked in Afghanistan, but any change in the agreement would change that calculation, and that American forces would start to take casualties again, and we'd be back at war. And the American public didn't want us back at war in Afghanistan. The other thing, and he'd seen this movie before as vice president, was that, it's not like we were winning in Afghanistan with 2,500 troops. Okay, if you'd asked any member of the intelligence community or read their national intelligence estimates on Afghanistan, we weren't winning. We were just slowly losing. They called it a stalemate, but actually it was 2 words: eroding stalemate, meaning that nobody was winning, but you're kind of losing over time. And so at a certain point, even had we not taken additional casualties, 2,500 wouldn't have been enough. The Pentagon would have come back to the president and asked for more. And how do we know that? Because they asked Obama for more and they asked Trump for more. So I think what Biden calculated was, if I try to make any changes to the agreement, Americans are going to get killed, and that will get us back in war, which the American public doesn't want. And that will create pressure for me to escalate in response. And even if it didn't, because we're not winning in Afghanistan, we are gradually losing. At some point, the Pentagon will come to the White House and say, the only way to turn this thing around is to put more troops in. Now, it's a counterfactual. We don't know those things would have happened, but the empirical record is pretty good that one of those 2 scenarios is likely. So for the president, the choice was, do I end the war now? Or do I tread water under the prospect that I will, either me or my successor will have to put more forces into a country that we've already spent 20 years investing in? Okay, anyway, that was his decision. And I don't mean, one can disagree with it, but I don't think anything I just said is crazy. And by the way, I will say, for all of the, harrowing nature of the evacuation, and we can talk about that because I did live through that, and that was an extraordinarily searing experience. There was not a day in the last 2 years of my job as Undersecretary of Policy, as we were dealing with Ukraine, or we were dealing with Taiwan, or we were dealing with issues in Africa, where I said, you know what would make these issues easier? We still had 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. There was never a day where I thought that the big challenges we were facing as a country would be easier if we had our troops still in Afghanistan. So that's also something to keep in mind. Did we do enough? I think the question on that, it's a good one, and there's this Afghanistan War Commission, which is going to look at it from a 20-year perspective, which I think is right. I will say that when the Trump administration signed the Doha Agreement in 2020, they did zero zero planning for either the withdrawal of our forces, the aftermath of the withdrawal of our forces, or for protecting innocent Afghan civilians, including those who had worked with us. Zero. So when we came in, they had withdrawn 2/3 of our troops and done zero planning. None. So I think they should also be asked, why didn't you do that? My own view about why the Pentagon didn't do that is that the Pentagon assumed that they would relitigate. That the Pentagon assumed that when the next administration came in, they would simply relitigate and get the president to reverse what Trump had done and put more forces in. And so the Pentagon tends, in my experience, the Pentagon doesn't plan for things they don't want to happen. So the Pentagon didn't do extensive, prior to our arrival, had not done extensive planning on the withdrawal, the aftermath, how to manage it, et cetera. That planning began when we came into office. So then the question is, was that planning adequate? I think CENTCOM and our forces in Afghanistan did a pretty good job of planning the retrograde, that is the withdrawal of our forces. The challenge was we were at such a small number, 2,500, that what our commanding general in Afghanistan concluded was speed was safety. In other words, once we determined to leave, we had to leave fast, not gradually, because the smaller we got, the harder it would be to defend ourselves, right? So a lot of people say, why did you abandon Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan? And there are kind of two answers for that. One is you can't leave Afghanistan without leaving Bagram. And two, to the degree that we were going to have 800 or 1,000 troops left to basically support our diplomatic mission in Afghanistan, they were going to be in Kabul at the embassy in Kaya. They were not going, which is the airfield in Kabul. They were not going to be at Bagram. So, essentially the commanding general and CENTCOM recommended to the Secretary of Defense and then upward to the president that once he made the decision in April, we actually had to have most of our forces out by July. And so that happened very quickly.
It's a good lawyerly brief. Let me just push you on one piece of that is DOD said we're leaving. State Department said we're not leaving. So the United States, at least in the March, April, May, June, maybe even into July timeframe, was saying the United States is staying, State Department is staying, we're going to stay in force, in size, but the security perimeter provided by the DOD is leaving. That appears to be the disconnect through which the cataclysm fell. So was that visible in the interagency meetings that you guys were doing in June, or did it only become visible late in July, at which point we're in crisis mode?
No, we had a series of tabletop exercises. In fact, I think the first one that I took part in was probably the fourth or fifth day of my job. Over at the Pentagon. We hosted a principals and deputies level conversation to go over the retrograde planning. And no, the president had said that we were going to keep our diplomatic presence in Kabul. And the Pentagon planning suggested that would require somewhere between 600 to 1,000 forces to remain in Afghanistan to essentially protect the embassy and to protect themselves. And so they would be based in a combination between the embassy compound, which is actually more kind of a green zone-ish area in Kabul, and then out at the airport. And we were also in negotiations with, the Turks and others about securing the airport. So we were never going to leave. The military was still, like, in the event that things had gone as planned, we would have left a contingent of somewhere between 600 and 1,000 American military troops in Afghanistan to protect the embassy. The issue was that their job was not to continue to provide support to the Afghan security forces, and so their job was to protect the embassy. That is, we would continue to provide advice, we would continue to provide equipment and training outside the country and over the horizon counterterrorism support and over the horizon contracting. But the reality is that a lot of that infrastructure that undergirded just the day-to-day stuff of the Afghan security forces were maintained not by the US military so much, but in a lot of cases by contractors. And so we were trying to work through how much of that would be a willingness of the contractors to stay in Afghanistan versus literally pulling out big pieces of Afghan equipment to be serviced in Qatar or UAE or even back in the United States. And that was pretty unwieldy. Although I will tell you, we have shown in the Ukraine case that we're able to do extraordinary amounts of remote maintenance. Like we have helped the Ukrainians a lot with maintenance on a much larger scale remotely without having a big presence. So we had a vision for doing that. I'm not sure it would have worked. The problem was, and this is now just my assessment, and I know we've been going on a long time, but that essentially when the Trump administration decided to withdraw, we pulled back from having a kind of granular, like a touch feel for the Afghan security forces. And they also saw that we were leaving. And that had two effects: our ability to assess their quality, their loyalty, their level of corruption, whether they were showing up, went down because we weren't present, and their incentive to cut deals at the local level with local Taliban and others went up. And so I think that in 2020, through the time of the withdrawal, there was a lot of stuff happening that we did not see. A lot of units getting hollowed out, a lot of commanders cutting deals, and that the house of cards was becoming even more fragile. And so I think when we pulled out those remaining forces, the house of cards collapsed, and collapsed much more rapidly than anybody anticipated. Certainly the intelligence community was telling the president when he made the decision, the Afghan government would last a year or two after the withdrawal. You know, by the summer that became 6 months, then it became 2 months, then it became 2 weeks, then it became days when it was days. But that's what happened.
One last Afghan question. You've been watching Afghanistan from the inside and a little bit from the outside, basically from 2002 on, right? So this is something you've thought about a lot. Was there a missed moment when we could have left Afghanistan with less catastrophe than we saw in August of 2021? Was there an earlier moment that said that would have been the time to go, that would have given us the decent interval President Biden thought he was getting?
I don't know. There was no obvious moment for me. Now there are much closer observers of Afghanistan than me. So others may have a better view. I will just say Obama really wanted to leave Afghanistan. And he, I think, because of the experience in Iraq, frankly, but also just because he couldn't get the interagency to give him a number anything lower than 5,000 that wouldn't lead to all hell breaking loose, came to the conclusion the next person was going to make this decision. And the challenge I think that President Biden had was he just wasn't willing to pass this on to another person. And look, in retrospect, given how much of a house of cards it was, maybe this is a self-serving comment, so people can criticize me. My view is, given where we were in 2021, unless we had massively reinvested in Afghanistan, that is, put more forces and more resources into Afghanistan, at any point after 2021, had we left, the exact thing that happened would have happened. And the only thing worse than all hell breaking loose in the summer of 2021 would be all hell breaking loose in the summer of 2025, or the summer of 2030, or the summer of 2035, after investing hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money and a lot more American lives. And the president just wasn't willing to run that calculus. I just don't see anything in the way that Afghanistan collapsed that suggests that if we had just stuck it out at status quo, things would have been fine, unless we were willing to be there forever. And the American public didn't want us to be there forever. And I also don't think being there at 2,500 was sustainable forever, because at some point, the Pentagon would have come back to the president and said, we're losing, we need more, because we were losing and we needed more.
I wonder if there's a footnote condition there, which is, provided that a terrorist threat of global reach doesn't reconstitute and strike us again. If between now and 2030 that happens, then we might say, might have been worth spending the relatively low amount of dollars and the very, very low cost and ops tempo, et cetera, by that time. I don't know, but
yeah, I mean, not low amounts of dollars. Not to be, maybe by the DoD, but $20 billion a year is not a little bit of money. It's a lot of bit of money. It's half what we've given to Ukraine so far in a year and a half. That's in military dollars. So $20 billion is a lot of money. I'll also say, ask whether Ayman Zawahiri believes that it's safe to be in Afghanistan if you're the head of Al-Qaeda. Oh, wait, you can't, because he's dead. And we've reached out and touched the highest echelons of ISIS in places where we do not have significant footprints. And I know we have some of the CT fellows here who work for JSOC. And is it easier to do things if you're there? It is. Can we reach out and touch you from anywhere in the world? We can. And we have demonstrated that repeatedly as a nation, and our adversaries shouldn't forget it. And we do have to be vigilant about threats that could emanate from Afghanistan. But frankly, I'm more worried about threats that could emanate from the Sahel or from Somalia or from other places. And I don't see people saying we should put 2,500 troops into Mali or Somalia. And so we have to figure out how to do this without having thousands of troops on the ground, because this threat is a global one that we can't be everywhere all at once.
Okay, let's move on to Ukraine, which was next up on your watch. And you said there was never a moment when you were regretting leaving Afghanistan. Some critics have said that Putin made calculations about President Biden's resolve, about the America's resolve, and that the catastrophe in Afghanistan functionally encouraged him to do so, maybe even via a concept like reputational deterrence. So help me understand why those critics are not right.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, first of all, I don't think any expert of Vladimir Putin, so, the Mike McFalls or Fiona Hills of the world, are the top Russia experts would say that the fundamental reason that Putin went into Ukraine was about Afghanistan. It wasn't. The fundamental reasons were about Ukraine. A belief that Ukraine is a part of Russia, a imperial revisionist ambition to reconstitute the Russian Empire, perhaps a degree of insecurity and fear about a Ukraine that's drifting into NATO's orbit, or that could be a platform for NATO to affect Russia, a fear that a democratic, successful Ukraine would be a contagion into Russia. Those were the main reasons why he did it. The Afghanistan issue, I think, as a social scientist, the question is, did it affect the timing, not the motive? It had nothing, and I don't think you're arguing.
No, I'm not arguing.
But I just want to be clear, it was not why he did it. I do think that Putin looked out in the world in 2021 and saw a bunch of things, okay? I think he saw the NATO alliance coming out of Afghanistan. I don't think it was about US resolve. I think it was perhaps that the NATO alliance was, they had come out of the turbulence of the Trump years, where he was threatening to pull out of NATO every other day and hanging up the phone every time he talked to Angela Merkel, to the Afghanistan issue, which was created turbulence within the alliance, the withdrawal and the aftermath. AUKUS, which is a huge diplomatic achievement, but also ruffled the feathers in Paris. I think he might have looked at and thought, you know what? Whenever I invade Ukraine, NATO's going to be divided, because they were divided in 2014 when I annexed Crimea and did what I did in the Donbass. And they'll be even more divided now because they're already kind of divided, right? So I think he thought that. But I also think he saw other things. He saw a new government in Germany and probably believed that with Angela Merkel gone, Germany would not be able to play the leadership role that it had played. He saw elections coming up in France and probably believed that President Macron would not invest a lot of political capital in standing up to Russia. And he saw winter approaching with high energy costs on the horizon, and probably believed that that gave him a lot of leverage. So do I believe that one of the things that sparked Putin's timing was a calculation about whether the West would hang together? I do. Can one make an argument that Afghanistan was one piece of 10 that factored into that? Probably, but it wasn't the most important thing. And I will also say this, as without going into any classified information, I never saw a piece of evidence, public or private, that led me to believe that Afghanistan was all that important to Putin's calculation.
And what about the related counterfactual that you hear often on the campaign trail, at least in the Republican side, that if Trump had won an election in 2020, Putin would not have invaded? Did you find any credence to that argument?
Only if one believes that he wouldn't have invaded because Putin and Trump would have cooperated to put pressure on Ukraine to cave and give concessions in the Donbass. I do not believe. No. Again, this is an analytic judgment, not a political one, and one can disagree with the analytic judgment. Stems from the fact mean, just look at the way Trump has talked about it on the campaign.
Right.
It's a territorial dispute. You know, I could resolve it in 24 hours, but the resolution in 24 hours is to get the Ukrainians to agree for Russia to continue to occupy 20% of Ukraine. And so I think what he would have said was, we don't want a war. And so Ukraine, if you want to avoid a war, you know, give Putin the Donbass. So I don't believe there's any evidence that Trump himself would have been more credible in making the deterrent argument to Putin. So for example, there's zero chance that Trump would have threatened to go to war with Russia, zero. So whatever one thinks of Joe Biden's admonition that we're not going to fight World War III over Ukraine, raise your hand if you think a President Donald Trump would have said, I'm going to fight Vladimir Putin and risk a nuclear war of Ukraine. Raise your hand if you believe that. Okay, he wouldn't have said that. So the other parts of deterrence are, I will mobilize, NATO will stand united behind me in devastating economic and political costs. Do we think Trump would have been more effective in mobilizing the West to do that? No. So I mean, he can say the war wouldn't have happened. There is no analytic reason to believe that that is true. And these are the types of things I said before the election that got me in trouble with confirmation.
You're becoming interesting again. Be careful. Okay. I want to give you an easy question, but I'm now pandering to, because you're
Am I a great undersecretary or the greatest?
No. You are the host of you are the guest of the American Grand Strategy Program.
Yes.
Where we emphasize.
Is it the grand or the grandest?
Yes, where we emphasize the value of strategic planning. Talk to me about the strategic planning the Biden administration did in advance of the invasion. I think it's one of the test cases for strategic planning. Did it help? Did it hurt? It's an easy one here.
Yeah. Look, I think it's something that people should study for a long time. And you know, people should study it in a way to ask, did we do too much, too little, too soon, too late, whatever. People should debate it. But I'm actually quite proud of what we did. So first of all, we have the finest intelligence apparatus in the history of the world. And I think that has been validated in the last couple of years. The intelligence community took a series of black eyes, 9/11, Iraq WMD. People can debate how fair or unfair that is, but I will just tell you that the credibility of our intelligence community as a whole has never completely recovered from 9/11, but certainly from Iraq WMD until now. And that is because we knew more about what Russia planned to do than the vast majority of Russian generals and officials because of how good our intelligence was. And the president made the very brave and risky decision in starting in late October of 2021 to share that information with the world, even though this was the crown jewels of American intelligence. Because we believed that we could declassify things in a way that preserved sources and methods, but most importantly, allowed us to go on offense in the information space to do a couple of things. One, to start rallying the world to signal to Putin that he would face cost, military cost in the sense of assistance to Ukraine, but especially political isolation and economic costs, sanctions, export controls, et cetera. And to just be relentless in building that coalition. Now, I will say, people didn't believe us until it actually happened. But the fact that we had spent 4 months doing it, and then it happened, meant that the day after it happened, the entire coalition snapped into place. So had we not done that 4 months of sharing information, planning, getting things ready, getting the playbook ready, it wouldn't have happened in the way that it did. The other way that it was helpful was we were very forward-leaning about disclosing information about the false flag operations the Russians planned to do to establish the predicate for blaming Ukraine for the invasion. And what that did was, the Russians still did most of these things, by the way. It's just when they happened, people interpreted them because we'd said they were going to happen. And then when they happened, they were like, oh yeah, it happened. As opposed to being able to say, well, there was a terrorist bombing in the Donbass. That justifies me invading Ukraine. So I also think it put Putin on the back foot a little bit. I think an interesting question is whether, why wasn't Putin deterred? And I think, at this point, we don't know. And I think there's a couple of hypotheses that social scientists, people should write dissertations on for a long time. One hypothesis is he was undeterrable. Ukraine mattered so much to him And he was convinced it mattered so much more to him than to the United States or the West, that there was no set of threats that we could have made that would have been credible, because he just would not have believed that we would be willing to do enough to him, that he would run more risk to achieve his objectives because he cared more. In kind of Tom Schelling terms, that the balance of stakes and resolve were in his favor, and therefore he was undeterrable. The other hypothesis is he was deterrable, but he miscalculated. That is, we said he would face all these costs, and he has faced all these costs. And if he, if he knew then what he knew, what he knows now, which is what has happened to him, 250,000 plus casualties, serious hit on the Russian economy, forcing them to rely and be a junior partner on Beijing, forcing them to turn to Pyongyang and Tehran for help, leaving their only allies in parts of the global South, and destroying the Russian army. Maybe he wouldn't have done it. And so one theory is he was undeterrable. One theory is that he miscalculated. And a third theory is what we talked about before, which is he believed it was possible that these costs would happen, but not likely because of the divisions in the West.
So one of the criticisms that the administration has received has been that you get a lot of credit for the early days, but then it seemed like the outside critics said, slow to arm the Ukrainians with the things that they think they now wish they had. F-16s, longer range missiles, ATACMS. You know the whole list. This is a common criticism you've heard once or twice before. What's your answer to that critique?
That not everybody, but that many of the folks who make that argument have never served in the executive branch of the U.S. federal government and fall victim to a degree of magical thinking. I'm just trying to be entertaining again.
Yes.
Okay. So, so to this point, the United States has provided close to $45 billion of security assistance to Ukraine. Did we have $45 billion on February 23rd of 2022? Anybody know?
You had appropriated.
Nope.
No, not on that early, but you've appropriated a lot, and then you've been spending it out.
All right, so we'll get to this. All right, so in the most important part of the war were the first 6 weeks. Why? Because that is where Putin's ambitions, his overall objectives for Ukraine, were not only defeated, but I believe permanently defeated, because he failed to decapitate the government in Kyiv. They failed to seize Kyiv. They failed to do their version of the Thunder Run and change the regime in Ukraine, and were forced to retreat in the Battle of Kyiv. And then now the war is concentrated in the east, in the south. So the broad ambitions to absorb Ukraine were defeated in those first 6 weeks. Did we have $45 billion in the first 6 weeks? Anybody know how much money we had in the first 6 weeks? $3 billion. Okay. Raise your hand if you think it would have been great if we had provided Patriot anti-air systems, M1 Abrams tanks, HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems, all these high-end, really potent systems. It would have been good to provide them with those systems right at the beginning of the war. Anybody know how much a Patriot battery costs? $1 billion for a single battery. How long does it take to train, even on an aggressive training schedule, and deliver? 10 weeks. Okay. M1 Abrams tanks, Bradleys, the Strykers, all the armored vehicles and tanks, when you add all that stuff up for what we provided, you're going to get close to another $1 billion. Okay. HIMARS, artillery systems, another $1 billion. None of that stuff would have delivered in the first 6 weeks. None of it was stuff the Ukrainians were trained on, and none of it would have actually allowed them to defeat the Russians. So when I was the Undersecretary for Policy and said, Colin, what should we spend that $3 billion on? My answer was not, let's spend it on a bunch of stuff they don't know how to use, they won't get in time, and won't make a hill of beans of difference for the current fight. Or instead of spending $1 billion on a Patriot system, how about you flood the zone with Stinger man-portable air defense systems and other short-range air defense systems, and scrounge the globe for interceptors for their Soviet legacy air defense systems, the S-300s, but also the shorter range systems. Because that's what we did, and that's what kept the Russian Air Force at bay. Instead of M1 Abrams tanks, we sent them Javelin anti-tank systems, which is what allowed them to clog up and bog down those huge convoys coming towards Kyiv, and ultimately allowed the artillery systems the Ukrainians had to devastate the Russian military. Why not give them HIMARS? Well, because I was busy making sure they had the money for the Soviet era ammunition for the hundreds and hundreds of artillery systems and MLRS systems they already had in their arsenal. So yes, would it have been great if we can kind of wave fairy dust over, sprinkle fairy dust over Ukraine and imagine they had everything they had now right at the beginning of the war? But I live in the real world, not in that magical
with
world.
Respect, the argument is either, wouldn't it have been great if this had been done 3-4 years ago and they had been better armed?
You mean during the Trump administration?
And also late in the Obama administration, when Obama chose not to equip them with.
I agree with that too.
Okay,
so that's Vice President Biden was in favor of providing support to.
I'm not actually
Ukraine.
talking about the historical argument.
Yeah.
That's one of them. The other piece, though, is once we hit the stable line of battle, then there was a debate. Okay, what do we equip?
Yeah,
that's from that point on. It has not necessarily been pedal to the metal. It's been, are we going to do it? Are we going to do it? Then when they finally do it, it's like that's
so
what the critics are.
This is also another. This is also that we should call this series Mythbusters.
Yes. Okay.
This is another myth. It's like we were sitting around not spending the money until we suddenly spent the money on the things that everybody talks about. We have spent almost $45 billion, $43 billion of that while I was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. More money than has ever been spent in any conflict ever in the history of the world to help a partner state, as far as I know. And if you had told me that the bureaucracy could deliver, that is, literally do the paperwork, get the stuff out of storage, get it downrange in that time period, I would have told you were crazy, and it happened. The money was being spent. It was just being spent on the stuff they needed in that moment. So we already talked about the first 6 weeks. Then the conflict shifted to Eastern Ukraine. So what did the Ukrainians need? They needed artillery. Why? Because we were running out of the ability to resupply their Soviet legacy artillery and MLRS. So what did we do? We started streaming them howitzers and 155 millimeter ammunition, and then we provided them the HIMARS, and then we provided them the guided multiple launch rocket systems. All of that happened in the summer as they were gearing up to fight in the East, and all of that is what enabled them to take back the territory in Kharkiv in the north and Kherson in the south. Oh, by the way, also with our help in terms of wargaming and in planning support and intelligence support and all of that. And then as we got into the fall and winter, the big issue was air defense because their Soviet air defense capabilities were running low. So we surged in NASAMS systems, scrounged up air defense systems from NATO allies and other allies, and to Secretary Austin's great credit, advocated for Patriot because we believed that the Russians were going to turn to the Iranians for ballistic missiles, and the systems they had that we were providing were better against cruise missiles than they were against ballistic missiles. So we provided them Patriot. We encouraged the Germans to do the same. And then as we were getting into the winter and building up toward the counteroffensive, we turned towards armored systems, the Leopard tanks, the Bradley and Stryker fighting vehicles, the thousands of MRAPs and Humvees, the armored vehicles that we used in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this is all to say, we weren't sitting around going, God, we just want to give another dollar to Ukraine, but we're getting so much crap in the front pages of the New York Times and in Congress, I guess we have to give it to the Ukrainians. We were thinking, what do they need right now? What can they use right now? What do they already know how to use or can get trained up quickly? And if I choose to spend something on something that's going to deliver 2 months from now or 6 months from now, is it worth it? Because it will come at the opportunity cost of the money that I spend right now. And also, when can you deliver it? How fast can you deliver it? How fast can they absorb it? These are actual questions. You can't wish these, not you personally, you can't wish these problems away. The last point I will make, there's been a lot of conversation recently about F-16s and long-range missiles, ATACMS. We can have all sorts of conversations about escalation dynamics and everything else. That is actually not the fundamental driver of those calculations. But I will tell you this, the struggles that the Ukrainians have had in the counteroffensive, not a single one would F-16s or ATACMS make a difference. The problem is not the deep fight. They can generate effects already through long-range drones and the cruise missiles they've gotten from the French and the British. The problem is not 100 kilometers away. The problem is 1 kilometer away. It's their challenges with the minefields and the defensive belts that the Russians have produced, and F-16s and ATACMS don't magically make those problems go away. So if you hear frustration in my voice, it's because I'm frustrated. As someone who dealt with this every single day, we weren't sitting around going, God, I really don't want to help Ukraine, but since we're getting criticized by the Republicans, I guess we'll have to help. That's not how it worked.
Okay, I'm going to ask my last question. I might trigger you one last time, but if you have questions, there's a microphone there, I think, and that's the place to come. So please stand in line if you want to ask a question. So fast forward to this summer, and the offensive is disappointing compared to, say, expectations. Did you have those same high expectations that folks on the outside seem to have as to what was going to happen? And as you know, there's a big debate inside DC right now. Did the Ukrainians take our advice? Did they make mistakes? Where are you in that debate? And that's my last question. And then let's.
And I'll try to be, I know I tend to, you ask short questions. I have like 10-minute answers. So look, first of all, I think we should all
this is part therapy, I think,
Yeah,
what
we
we're
should-
doing here. So yeah.
we should all be cautious about heaping too much criticism on the Ukrainians. Why? Because they're the ones fighting and dying. This is their country. These are their choices to make. We can offer them advice. They can take it. They cannot take it. Our advice might be wrong. It might be right. It is ultimately their country. So if they choose to fight the war in a particular way, that is their choice. Okay, it's not American blood being spilled. It's Ukrainian blood being spilled by the tens of thousands. And we should never forget that. All I can say is from an administration perspective, we did an extraordinary amount over a short period of time to do two things. One was to build this huge arsenal of equipment, armored equipment, engineering equipment to support a counteroffensive. Second, which doesn't get as much attention, to do a crash course on combined arms training. Principally, large unit, battalion level training, but also brigade and above headquarters level training in places like Germany, to try to encourage the Ukrainians to not fight like the Russians. Soviet doctrine is very methodical in the sense of you lay waste with artillery, and then you move forward into what is essentially, a desert, and then you kind of do that and you push forward. Ukraine does not have the artillery. The West does not have the artillery they can't win that way. Secretary Austin would sometimes say you're not going to beat big Russia by being little Russia. You got to fight differently. That was our thinking during the Cold War. That is still our thinking. Maybe that's wrong. So some people can challenge that, but that was the mentality going in. So how do you help the Ukrainians combine fire and maneuver? That said, it's hard. A lot of the troops being trained, relatively new, and training and experience that sometimes takes years for U.S. Army and Marine officers and enlisted folks to participate. We're putting them in a crash course over the course of 6 or 8 weeks. And the enemy has a vote, and the Russians suck at offense, but they're pretty good at defense. And Surovikin, who's now in jail somewhere probably, did a pretty good job of putting in these defensive belts, especially in the south, because it was no secret that the Ukrainians wanted to push south to try to get to the Sea of Azov and snap the land bridge to Crimea. And so they put these layered minefields and dragon's teeth and trenches and anti-armor positions in multiple layers. And, the American way of war is essentially to use reconnaissance to identify a weak spot and then mass and then rapidly surge through that weak spot to exploit that. The Ukrainians have not been able to do that. I think the criticism one sees is they gave themselves a number of opportunities. They had a major operation going on in the east around Bakhmut. They had 2 operations in the south. They were probing for a weak point and then the goal was to hold a lot of combat power in reserve and surge forward when they found a weak spot. I think the criticism you hear from some quarters is that they refuse to make a choice. And that instead they've spread themselves too thin. And as a result, they're kind of involved in a war of attrition everywhere, and they're not making gains anywhere. But that's their choice. I think a lot of folks Monday morning quarterbacking, asking the question, why do you invest so much in the East when the South is clearly more is clearly more important? You'd have to ask President Zelensky and his advisors about that. All of that said, I don't think we're done yet. I think that the Ukrainians still have considerable combat power. And if they identify a weak point and a vulnerability point, they do have the ability to exploit it. And I believe the Russians are soft underneath. I believe their morale is low. I believe their munitions are low. I believe they're not well led. I think the Prigozhin mutiny has created more chaos in the ranks than people presume. I believe that if the Ukrainians can get through, they have real opportunities. The question is whether they'll get through.
All right.
Hey there. Is this on? How about that? I'm interested in your opinions on China's policies in the Middle East, alliance building, security, and intelligence sharing agreements.
Yeah, I think China's perspective is that that if you're sitting in Beijing, you would love for the United States to continue to be the security guarantor for the Middle East, because that our Navy does something the PLA Navy cannot, which is keep the sea lines of communication open for the flow of oil and gas to the global economy, to include China. So I don't think China has ambitions to dominate the region militarily. I do think they'd like to establish a base somewhere on the Gulf, most likely in UAE. They have not been able to culminate that yet, but that's clearly an ambition that they have. I think they would also like to sell, a lot of military hardware to wealthy countries in the Middle East, in particular in the Gulf. I think they would love to provide, digital services of all kinds, whether that be cyber, Huawei involving in 5G, artificial intelligence. I think that some of the governments in the region are also, I think, attracted to, frankly, to be blunt, China's digital authoritarian model, and would be keen to accept some of those technologies. I think the challenge for the United States is the more that our traditional security partners in the region get deeply involved with China militarily and on the intelligence side, the less they'll be able to do with us. And I don't mean that from a punitive perspective. It's not like, hey, you choose Beijing over it, you're dead to us. It's not that. It's that literally, if there is a Chinese base in Abu Dhabi, we cannot have F-35 aircraft flying off the base next door. We can't because the Chinese are going to collect on that aircraft in all sorts of ways that'll undermine our security. So if there's a base in Abu Dhabi and we choose to pull out our aircraft from Abu Dhabi, it's not to punish the Emiratis, it's to protect our security. Likewise, if they decide to go and put a bunch of Huawei infrastructure in ways that produce significant counterintelligence threats to us, we should raise that. The other point I would make is, if our partners believe that they can buy a bunch of Chinese air defense systems or others and plug it into the American-based networks for regional air and missile defense, that's not going to happen. Not because, again, we're punitive, but because it would threaten our interests. And if I were sitting in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, I would ask myself, there's an unparalleled opportunity to build a regional air and missile defense architecture that involves other countries in the Gulf, the United States, and Israel. Only the United States can be the integrator in that equation. Beijing cannot. So you can't do both. And so they will have to choose.
Thank you for being with us, Dr. Kahl. So in your role as Undersecretary for Policy, you had a key role in securitizing and synchronizing assistance for Ukraine. In your experience, what were the biggest challenges that you faced in coordinating aid? And then based on the conversation that we've had, you've used the terms scrounging or encouraging allies. Would you say that the biggest challenges were mainly domestic, or were they based in coordinating aid internationally with allies?
Yes. No, and not to be a wise guy, but all the things you pointed out, your question, in fact, I think has embedded within it most of the answers. So to be brief, most of the money that we have provided has been through what's called Presidential Drawdown Authority, which is just a fancy way of saying an authority whereby the president can transfer our own stocks of weapons, things we have right now, to the Ukrainians. That's not typically how we do arms sales and security systems. We do it by putting things on contract and then things get delivered too late and overpriced. So in this case, we're literally pulling things out of the stockpiles of the Army or the Marines or the Navy or the Air Force and providing it to the Ukrainians, mostly from the Army. And so one consideration that we've had to balance is readiness. How do we provide systems like HIMARS, Patriot, the interceptors and missiles that go along with that, the guided multiple launch rocket systems, the Patriot interceptor missiles? How do you provide 155 ammunition? How can you provide that in sufficient quantities such that it has meaningful effects for the Ukrainians without crippling our own military? The ability of our army to do what it needs to do if they're called upon by the nation to defend the United States, because ultimately we're stewards of US taxpayer dollars, and I love the Ukrainians, but I was a US official, so I'm going to prioritize US national interests. So we had to constantly weigh how much risk we could take in drawing down our own stockpiles for things like if we had a war in the Korean Peninsula or with Iran or with Russia ourselves or with China or whatever, do we have enough left over? So those considerations. Second thing is, how do we get the allies and partners to do as much as they can? I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat on the Hill, the first question they will ask you is, why aren't the allies doing more? Right? Which is always, now, I should say the allies have done a lot, but the reality is the rest of the world has contributed about what we have contributed, right? So the United States has contributed $45 billion, the rest of our allies and partners about the same amount. Now, they've contributed in lots of other ways, like the United States has not absorbed 9 or 10 million Ukrainian refugees, right? So the Europeans are paying that bill, and sometimes that doesn't get put into the equation. But that said, our allies could always do more, and I think, but their stockpiles are much more strained than ours because their defense budgets have been too low for too long, and all of us have underinvested in munitions over the years, overinvested in platforms, think planes, ships, and not the bombs and the missiles that fly off those planes and ships. So, getting our allies and partners to commit their more limited resources. But I give Secretary Austin tremendous credit because starting about a year ago, once a month, he convened a defense ministerial with defense ministers and chiefs of defense from 50 countries with the sole purpose of ginning up support for Ukraine. And as anybody who's worked in government, doing one of those is really hard. Now imagine your organization was responsible for putting one of those on once a month. My organization was, and we did it, and they were awesome. And it served not only our country well, but the Ukrainians well, but getting our allies and partners. And the third is making the investments in our defense industrial base, because I think what the Ukraine war has demonstrated is that none of us were ready for a high intensity conflict. That a lot of the hangover from the war on terrorism is the presumption of a different kind of conflict, a different type of expenditure rate for certain types of munitions. And that if we ever had a war with Russia or China, Ukraine is demonstrating the model that we've had in the last 20 or 30 years is not the right model. And so we've had to make major investments in our own defense industrial base. And that's coming at a time of supply chain shortages, still dealing with issues with COVID. I love the fact that unemployment is low, but it actually makes hiring people to work in munitions factories hard. So like making the investments in the defense industrial base, that was another issue.
We're not going to get through everybody, but we'll get through more if we double them up. So let's take two and then you can respond to the two. So the next two.
In the recent New Yorker article on Elon Musk's influence, you were quoted as talking about having to treat him like a statesman or a diplomat or a politician. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on his influence and the private company's influence over the defense industry.
Yeah, that'll get attention. Take a crack at Musk. Okay, yeah, next.
Yes, my question relates to the Sahel region, which you mentioned earlier in your talk. So given the recent slew of coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and now in Niger, how should U.S. respond, and what role does that play to the U.S.'s role as a defender of democracy in Africa and around the world?
From space to the Sahel. Welcome to the job of the Undersecretary. So just on the Musk thing, I mean, you read the article. I said what I said. I think the point was not that Musk is a statesman. It's that he was having conversations with Zelensky and with Putin, and the role that Starlink was playing in the conflict, because it was the single point of failure for Ukraine's internet to include the ability of its military to continue to communicate, meant that he was an important actor. And so he needed to be treated as an important actor. I think that's kind of self-obvious. He is an important actor. He's the richest man in the world. SpaceX, Tesla, Twitter, now X, these are hugely important and impactful companies. But This is not new, right? The Bill Gateses of the world. I mean, we've had very wealthy individuals in the past, and they have played an outsized role in domestic and international politics. I think, you know, Elon Musk fits that category. So that's what that is. On the Sahel, look, we have to care about the Sahel because, you know, failed and failing states in the Sahel are safe havens for violent extremist organizations associated with ISIS and Al Qaeda. Now, the good news is these groups are largely focused on local, regional, and domestic interests, not the U.S. homeland, but that's something we have to be vigilant against the prospect of. And as these countries fall, it not only gives, you know, more running room for these groups, but it provides, you know, fewer partners for us to work with. Our strategy in the Sahel, because this has been kind of an economy of force mission, we don't have tens of thousands of troops in West Africa. We don't have tens of thousands of troops in Africa, period. And I don't think there's a lot of advocates for us doing that, has been to act by, with, and through our partners, both local partners like until recently Niger, or international partners like the French. The French would be the first to admit their experience in West Africa has a lot of colonial baggage associated with it. So when you had the coup in Mali, you know, the new government whipped up anti-French sentiment and essentially chased the French out and invited the Russians in the form of Wagner. So the other complication in the Sahel is that the Russians are crawling all over the Sahel. Now, it'll be interesting to see what Wagner 2.0 or 3.0 ends up looking like in Africa, because what you saw in the 2 months before Prigozhin's demise was the Kremlin asserting control over parts of Wagner, pulling it apart, absorbing pieces of it, rebranding pieces of it. But the one place where Wagner seemed particularly indispensable is in Africa. And so I think the fact that Prigozhin and a few of his close, you know, most senior lieutenants are now dead raises this question of how much Wagner can continue to be effective. So I do think we should look for opportunities in that. But there are real challenges, and I know this doesn't seem, but when you have a region full of governments that have had coups, and you have US laws that prohibit you from cooperating with countries that have coups, it's very difficult to go to an interagency meeting and say, you know what we should do is cooperate with these countries, right? Like I know that sounds like there's not an unlimited set of options because of law for no other reason.
Next two.
Hey, good evening, sir. My name is CJ Koch. I'm interested in the Washington Declaration. What were the events that led to the Washington Declaration? Did South Korea question our ability to provide extended deterrence? And now that we have the Washington Declaration and we brought South Korean planners to our nuclear planning, will that provide effective deterrence to North Korea?
And I think we'll make this the last question. So sorry to those who didn't get to ask.
First thing, thank you so much, Dr. Kahl, for coming out here and speaking. My name is Mark Thomas Patterson, and my question is about the role of media in foreign policy making and in defense policy making. Something you bring up and that I've seen in my own work and my own scholarship looking at the 1990s is that the media plays a big role in creating concerns, whether it be about loose nukes, WMDs, or lack of aid to Ukraine. When you were in the Pentagon, how much did you see these concerns coming in and influencing policy and decisions that policymakers made? Thank you.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know, the Washington Declaration is basically an agreement between the United States and the ROK, South Korea, to bolster our extended deterrent commitment to South Korea. So the nuclear umbrella, make it more credible with the South Koreans. Why is such a agreement, why is such a declaration needed or important? I think for a couple of reasons. You had, you know, a South Korean government, a conservative South Korean government that came into power, you know, after a government that had tried to reach out to North Korea unsuccessfully, but also during an American administration that had made the South Korean public very nervous about the commitment, sustainability of the US commitment. So you had those two political factors. And so you started to see opinion polls and rhetoric in South Korea for the first time in a long time talking about whether South Korea should acquire its own, either request the United States put, you know, nuclear weapons back on the peninsula, or South Korea pursue its own nuclear program, right? And as Peter will know, because he's old, we haven't actually, most of the concerns about proliferation in the last 30 years have been about rogue state proliferation. Allied proliferation has not actually been something. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to get used to again in an age of great power competition is the types of things we had to deal with in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s about worrying about treaty allies proliferating. And so there was concern that South Korea, which certainly has the capability to build nuclear weapons, to do so. I don't think they were likely to do so. It was in the air again. And so we tried to look for a way to bring South Korea more into our nuclear planning apparatus in the way that, say, NATO allies are. And that's what South Korea wanted. And to reaffirm that the US commitment to South Korea was ironclad, our nuclear umbrella was unquestioned, and that we were going to take steps to make that more credible, not just to North Korea, but to the South Koreans themselves. And in exchange, the ROK agreed in the Washington Declaration to sustain their NPT commitments. So that was the bargain. Whether it'll work, I don't know. Well, it's too soon to tell. Whether it'll deter North Korea, I think this is a really important point to make, which is deter them from what? Will it deter North Korea from popping off ballistic missile and cruise missile tests? No. Nothing will deter them from doing that. In fact, the more we do things to hug South Korea, the more they will do those things. So it's not a failure of deterrence if North Korea tests a ballistic missile. A failure of deterrence is if North Korea invades South Korea. So measured it by the metric of, is the alliance in better shape now than it was 4 years ago? Unquestionably, it is. I do think that the ROK is nervous, like a lot of our allies are in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe and elsewhere, about whether this renewal of closeness is sustainable. Not just because who might be the next president, but just the politics in the United States. And I think there's just no matter where you go in the world, people wonder whether the United States, which is re-engaged with the world, whether that re-engagement is sustainable. And I think that's a challenge we're going to have to continue to face, not just with South Korea, but with other countries. I will say there's a huge opportunity that South Korea represents, and that's not only things to do bilaterally with them, but things to do trilaterally. And you saw with the recent summit that President Biden hosted with the South Korean president and the Prime Minister of Japan at Camp David, there's a lot of potential for South Korea and Japan that have a lot of historical baggage going back to World War II to nevertheless take political risk to move that relationship forward with us, not only because they're worried about North Korea, but also because of China. And I think that that's something we should lean into, that trilateral arrangement. It's a huge opportunity for those countries and for us to work with them. Media influence on policy. It's hard to say. I don't think it's rarely direct. I mean, sometimes like if the media, like there's a scandal or something that gets unearthed, then there's a direct line between like a media story about something and taking remedial action about something. Usually the media is part of a broader conversation that at a certain point becomes sufficiently politically costly that the system has to respond. I will say that it's not, largely as someone who, was a policy person at the Pentagon, I didn't do domestic politics. I didn't worry about the politics of things. I tried to call balls and strikes to the secretary and to the interagency based on what I thought was the right thing to do and let other people factor in the politics. So, and when we're sitting around the Situation Room at the Deputies Committee, we didn't talk about domestic politics. That was for other people to factor in. But obviously, the media narrative around things can generate pressure on things like Ukraine, for example. And so, yeah, that it can matter in that way.
So I told my staff that you would be an excellent first guest, and I love it when I'm right, because there's nothing the crowd loves better than when our guest beats me around the head and shoulders. And you've done that well, and you've ably defended the Biden administration's record, and you've served the country well. Thank you, Colin, and thank you.
Thanks for your great questions. Not your great questions, your great questions.